October 6th, 1943. Somewhere over the North Sea, at an altitude where the air can kill you, a man is unconscious in the bomb bay of a wooden aircraft. He can't hear the pilot screaming at him through the intercom, can't hear anything at all. His flight helmet doesn't fit, his head is too large, and the earpieces have slipped away from his ears, so when the pilot ordered him to switch on his oxygen supply, the instruction went nowhere. He's been breathing thin air for minutes now. His body has gone slack in the cramped, coffin-like compartment where bombs usually sit. The pilot doesn't know if his passenger is alive or dead. What he does know is that the man in his bomb bay might be the most important human being on the aircraft, possibly one of the most important human beings alive. His name is Niels Bohr. He's a Nobel laureate, a pioneer of quantum mechanics, a man who understands things about the atom that perhaps 50 people on Earth fully grasp. And right now, he's suffocating inside the belly of a de Havilland Mosquito, being smuggled out of Nazi-occupied Europe at 300 miles per hour. The pilot does the only thing he can. He pushes the nose down and drops to a lower altitude where the atmosphere is thick enough to breathe without supplemental oxygen. Somewhere in the descent, Bohr's brain gets what it needs. He stirs, blinks, comes back. He'll arrive in Scotland disoriented, confused, alive, and he'll go on to help build the most destructive weapon in human history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why the British government would risk one of its most prized aircraft and two of its aircrew to smuggle a 57-year-old physicist across occupied Europe in a bomb bay, you need to understand who Niels Bohr actually was. Not the name on a textbook, the man. Born in Copenhagen on October 7th, 1885, meaning this flight happened one day before his 58th birthday, which is the kind of detail nobody would bother to invent. Bohr grew up in a household that was intellectually extraordinary, even by academic standards. His father was a professor of physiology at the University of Copenhagen. His mother came from the Adler family, prominent in Danish Jewish banking and parliamentary circles. His brother Harold became a mathematician and an Olympic silver medalist in football. Niels just became the man who changed how humanity understands matter itself. He wasn't a flashy prodigy. He was slow, methodical, the kind of thinker who turned ideas over and over in his hands like river stones, wearing them smooth until something fundamental appeared underneath. In 1913, at 27 years old, Bohr proposed a model of the atom that broke physics wide open. The problem was simple to state and impossible to solve. Everyone knew electrons orbited the nucleus, but classical physics said they should spiral inward and collapse, which they obviously didn't. Bohr's answer was that classical physics was wrong, at least at the atomic scale. Electrons, he proposed, existed only in specific quantized orbits. They could jump between energy levels, but never occupy the space between them. Bizarre, counterintuitive, and it predicted the spectral lines of hydrogen with stunning accuracy. The Nobel Committee gave him their prize in 1922. But the Bohr model was prologue. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Bohr transformed his Institute for Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen into the undisputed global capital of the quantum revolution. Every name you've ever heard from that era passed through those halls. Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, Max Born. They came because Bohr was there, and Bohr had a gift that went beyond his own brilliance. He made other people smarter. His method was relentless, almost maddening dialogue, taking a young physicist's half-formed idea and interrogating it, challenging it, flipping it inside out, asking, "But what does it mean?" until something crystallized. Heisenberg developed his uncertainty principle while working under Bohr. The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, the framework that still dominates how physicists think about measurement, probability, and reality, bore the city's name because it was born in Bohr's institute, in Bohr's conversations, under Bohr's intellectual pressure. And then there were the debates with Einstein. Albert Einstein couldn't accept quantum mechanics. Not the math was fine. The philosophy. The idea that nature was fundamentally probabilistic, that a particle didn't have a definite position until someone measured it, that God, as Einstein put it, was playing dice with the universe. God does not play dice, Einstein reportedly told Bohr, to which Bohr reportedly replied, "Stop telling God what to do." They went at it at the 1927 Solvay conference, again at 1930. Einstein kept constructing brilliant thought experiments designed to prove quantum mechanics was incomplete. Bohr kept demolishing them, sometimes overnight, arriving at breakfast with a refutation so elegant it made Einstein laugh even as it infuriated him. It was the greatest intellectual rivalry of the 20th century, conducted between two men who genuinely loved each other. Einstein never won the argument. Bohr never lost a friend. That golden age ended in January 1933. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and the quantum physics community that orbited Bohr's institute was devastated almost overnight. Jewish physicists expelled from German universities. Max Born fled to Britain. Einstein left for Princeton and never went back. Dozens of brilliant minds scattered across the globe, careers destroyed, lives threatened by the mere fact of their ancestry. Copenhagen became a way station for the displaced. Bohr used his institute and his considerable international reputation to help refugee scientists find positions, secure visas, escape. He wasn't a political man by temperament. History was making him one. Germany occupied Denmark on April 9, 1940. It took roughly 6 hours. The Danish government, unable to resist militarily, entered an uneasy arrangement with its occupiers, cooperation in exchange for a measure of autonomy. Bohr stayed. His institute continued to operate. The Germans, for a time, left him alone. He was too famous to simply arrest, and the cooperative arrangement gave him a fragile shield of protection. Then came the visit that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. September 1941. Werner Heisenberg, Bohr's former protégé, the physicist who developed the uncertainty principle in Bohr's own building, now the leading scientist in Nazi Germany's atomic research program, travelled to occupied Copenhagen. He came to see Bohr. What they discussed during their private conversation has become the single most debated encounter in the history of modern science. Michael Frayn built an entire celebrated play around it, Copenhagen, premiered 1998, precisely because nobody knows what was actually said. Did Heisenberg come to extract information about Allied nuclear research from his old mentor? Did he come to subtly signal that the German bomb program was failing and that he was deliberately letting it fail? Did he come seeking moral absolution, wanting Bohr to tell him it was acceptable for physicists on both sides to quietly slow their respective programs? Or did he come to boast? Nobody knows. Bohr never gave a definitive account. What's clear is the meeting ended badly. Bohr was shaken. He understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that the Germans were actively pursuing an atomic weapon, and that Heisenberg, his Heisenberg, the student he'd mentored through his most brilliant work, was leading the effort. The friendship didn't survive that conversation, and the knowledge Bohr carried away from that evening made him, in the eyes of Allied intelligence services, an extraordinarily valuable asset. He knew what the Germans were doing. He understood the physics deeply enough to assess their progress. and he was trapped in occupied Denmark. For 2 more years he stayed, but by autumn 1943 the fragile Danish arrangement was collapsing. In August, the Danish government resigned rather than comply with German demands to crack down on resistance activities. Martial law came down hard, and word reached Bohr that the Gestapo was preparing to arrest him. His mother's Jewish heritage made him a target under Nazi racial laws, and his international fame no longer offered any protection. On the night of September 30th, 1943, Bohr and his family escaped across the Öresund Strait to neutral Sweden by fishing boat. They were part of something much larger, a spontaneous, astonishing act of collective courage that remains one of the most remarkable rescue operations of the entire war. Over the following weeks, Danish citizens organized the evacuation of nearly the entire Danish Jewish population. Fishermen, doctors, taxi drivers, ordinary people, they hid their Jewish neighbors in attics and churches and hospital basements, then loaded them onto boats under cover of darkness. Roughly 7,000 people were ferried to safety. Bohr was in Stockholm, safe. But safe wasn't the same as useful, and the British and Americans needed him to be useful. His knowledge of German nuclear research, combined with his own theoretical brilliance, made him urgently needed for the Manhattan Project, the Allied atomic bomb program then operating at full intensity in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Getting him from Stockholm to Britain meant flying over German-occupied Norway and across the open North Sea, a route where conventional aircraft would be sitting targets for Luftwaffe fighters and coastal radar, which is where a certain wooden airplane enters the story. The British Overseas Airways Corporation maintained a covert air service between neutral Sweden and Britain. Crews called it the ball bearing run, named for the critical Swedish ball bearings that were among its most important cargoes. The aircraft BOAC used were unarmed de Havilland Mosquitoes, chosen for one overwhelming reason. Nothing the Luftwaffe had could catch them. One number tells you everything. The Mosquito B-16 had a maximum speed of 408 miles per hour at 28,000 feet. Germany's standard night fighter, the Bf-110G, topped out at 342. The more capable Ju-88G could manage 389 in ideal conditions, and not at the altitudes where the Mosquito operated. The aircraft was built from birch plywood over a balsa and spruce core, wood, not metal, which made it lighter and, counterintuitively, faster than anything the Germans could field against it. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, a crew of 2, 0 defensive armament, no guns, no turrets. Geoffrey de Havilland's philosophy was elegantly simple. If nothing can catch you, you don't need to shoot back. This same type of aircraft was, at that very moment, making the Luftwaffe look ridiculous on an almost nightly basis. On January 30th, 1943, 8 months before Bohr's escape, 3 Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron had bombed Berlin in broad daylight during the 10th anniversary celebrations of Hitler's rise to power, cutting Goering's nationwide radio address off the air for 1 hour and 3 minutes. That same afternoon, 3 more from No. 139 Jamaica Squadron disrupted Goebbels' speech to thousands in the Schöneberg district, twice in 1 day. The light night striking force was sending Mosquitoes over Berlin almost every night, each dropping a 4,000-pound cookie bomb on the capital, compiling a loss rate of just 0.38% over 28,215 wartime sorties. The Germans had coined a word for the specific dread these raids produced: Mosquito panic, and another for the altitude band they simply couldn't reach, Mosquito-Höhe, mosquito height. Goering himself had raged to German aircraft manufacturers that the Mosquito made him turn green and yellow with envy at a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building. The Luftwaffe tried building their own copy. The Focke-Wulf TA-154, literally named the Mosquito, depended on a specialized adhesive manufactured at a single factory in Wuppertal. Allied bombers destroyed that factory. The replacement adhesive was catastrophically inferior. Airframes delaminated in flight, wings separated from fuselages. The program collapsed. Germany couldn't catch the Mosquito, and it couldn't copy it either. This was the aircraft they chose to carry Niels Bohr to safety. October 6, 1943, Stockholm. The BOAC Mosquito's bomb bay had been converted into a cramped passenger compartment for its courier flights. Cramped is generous. The space was designed for a cylindrical high-explosive weapon, not a human being. Bohr folded himself into this coffin-sized space on the eve of his 58th birthday. The crew gave him a flight helmet fitted with an intercom, his only connection to the pilot, his only lifeline during a several-hour flight across some of the most dangerous airspace in Europe. One instruction mattered above all others. At high altitude, the air is too thin to sustain consciousness. When the pilot gave the word, the passenger had to activate the oxygen supply built into the helmet. Fail to do that, and you'd pass out within minutes. Die not long after. Niels Bohr had an unusually large head. This is documented fact, the kind of mundane physical detail that history normally ignores, but that nearly killed one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. The helmet didn't fit. The earpieces didn't seal. When the Mosquito climbed and the pilot transmitted the instruction to switch on oxygen, Bohr heard nothing. He just sat there, breathing thinner and thinner air. Then he wasn't conscious anymore. The pilot called again. No response. Again. Silence. He couldn't leave the cockpit, couldn't reach the bomb bay. All he could do was shove the nose down, trade altitude for air pressure, descend to a height where the atmosphere alone could keep a human brain alive. Bohr woke up somewhere in that descent. Didn't know how long he'd been out. Didn't know how close he'd come to dying in a plywood box above the North Sea, one day before his birthday, carrying secrets about the structure of the atom that two nations were racing to weaponize. He landed in Scotland, groggy and disoriented, but breathing. The Germans didn't know he was gone until he was already there. Within weeks, Bohr was at Los Alamos, traveling under the codename Nicholas Baker, quite possibly the most transparent pseudonym in the history of classified programs, since every physicist on site recognized him immediately. Robert Oppenheimer revered him. The younger scientists had grown up on his papers. His arrival was electric. Bohr's contribution wasn't a single eureka moment, it was intellectual architecture. He helped refine the understanding of fission processes. He participated in design discussions. He asked the questions nobody else was willing to ask. Not just, can we build this, but what happens to the world after we do? Because Bohr, almost alone among the Los Alamos physicists in 1944, was already thinking about the aftermath. He understood something the military planners and most of his colleagues hadn't yet confronted. The atomic bomb wouldn't end the threat of war. It would transform it permanently. If America built the bomb, the Soviets would build one too. And then the world would live under the permanent shadow of mutual annihilation. Bohr believed the only way to prevent this was radical transparency, sharing information about nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union before the war ended, establishing international control before the arms race could begin. He took this case to the people who could have acted on it. He met with Winston Churchill in May 1944. Churchill wasn't just uninterested, he was apparently hostile, possibly suspecting Bohr of wanting to hand secrets to the Russians. He met with Franklin Roosevelt in September 1944. Roosevelt was warmer, but ultimately non-committal. Nothing changed. The bomb was built, it was used. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. Nagasaki, August 9th. The war ended. The arms race began. Exactly as Bohr had predicted. He went home to Copenhagen, back to his institute. He spent his remaining years arguing for the international control of nuclear energy, open scientific exchange between nations, the prevention of exactly the catastrophe he'd foreseen. He published an open letter to the United Nations in 1950, making this case with everything he had. Nobody really listened. The Cold War was already freezing solid. The Soviets tested their first atomic weapon in 1949. The hydrogen bomb followed. Niels Bohr died on November 18, 1962, in Copenhagen. He was 77. The Cuban Missile Crisis had ended barely 3 weeks earlier. The closest the world came to the nuclear war he'd spent 17 years trying to prevent. Here's what stays with me about this story. A man who spent the 1920s unlocking the fundamental structure of matter, who understood better than almost anyone alive what he'd found and what it meant, was smuggled out of Nazi-occupied Europe in the bomb bay of a wooden airplane so he could help build a weapon he'd spend the rest of his life trying to put back in the box. The Mosquito that carried him was the same type of aircraft that was humiliating the Luftwaffe nightly over Berlin, that had silenced Goering on the Reich's anniversary, that the Germans couldn't catch and couldn't copy and couldn't even build a working imitation of. A trickster plane, fast, clever, impossible to pin down. Bohr was something like that too. The Nazis dismissed him, a half-Jewish physicist in a small occupied country, building ideas from abstract mathematics the way the Mosquito was built from workshop timber. They let him sit in Copenhagen for 3 years before they moved to arrest him. By the time they reached, he was gone. Across the strait, into the Bombay, over the North Sea, out of reach forever. And what he carried in his head proved more consequential than any 4,000-pound cookie dropped on Berlin. The Mosquito's bombs could flatten a building. What Bohr helped create could flatten a city. The difference was that Bohr understood what that meant. He understood it before Hiroshima, before Nagasaki, before the mushroom clouds became the defining image of an age. And he said so, to Churchill, to Roosevelt, to the United Nations, to anyone who would listen, in a world that mostly wouldn't. He passed out at altitude with a helmet that didn't fit his oversized head, woke up somewhere over the North Sea, landed in Scotland one day before his 58th birthday, confused and gasping, and walked straight into a future that would reshape human civilization. One physicist, one wooden airplane, one Bombay that was never designed to carry anything alive. The 20th century turned on stranger hinges than this, but not many. Subscribe for more stories like this.